Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in for another um, interviews, tech visionary interviews. As you already know, these are interviews targeting or CXO, CEO, CIO, or let's say manager, decision makers level audience with some advisory on how to use tech and how technology can be used. And today we are uh, glad to have Dr. Greg Liu from Australia. Hi, Greg. How are you
Hey,
doing?
Reza, how are you?
Good, good. Thank you. Very glad to see you here. Would you mind introducing yourself a little bit? Tell us about your background, what you do these days.
Yeah, look, I'm Greg. I run a boutique consultancy, the way we normally say it, in Australia. We're actually based in the middle of the East Coast nowadays, just around Coffs Harbour area, but I spend a lot of time still working in Melbourne and grew up in Brisbane, so sort of different parts of the country I do still spend quite a while in. Um, Most of our work is all just data related, and so that's probably the key thing. The majority of the clients I work with are superannuation companies or banks or large financials, those sorts of places. Although we also at the moment are dealing with a large chain of timber mills, and so been learning more about timber grading and things than I ever thought I would. So no, it's
That's
interesting.
that's interesting. You've been like data platform MVP for such a long time. I think it's more than like is it 20 years
Yeah,
already
it's
now?
20
Yeah.
years.
Okay.
Yeah. This time was the 20th. Yeah.
That's a fantastic.
Interestingly, I wasn't originally the very first award I had was for ADO.net
All right.
back in the developer groups, but yeah, then moved the second year across to SQL Server.
Nice. That's fantastic. So it's great that you come with like that wealth of let's say understanding of how technology evolved from let's say 20 years ago till now and how it is going to shape in the future, which is good to talk about like the topic of the talk today, which is transformation versus migration. So like there are lots of talks about like transformation, migration, things like that. What do you see as like the difference between these?
Yeah, look, what I see, I work in, as I said, a lot of sort of tier one financials and places, and in surprising number of them in recent years, you'll find they've decided to have I don't know, a seismic shift within the organization. And in many cases, the old CTO has gone, the chief technology officer or whatever, and they brought someone new in with a cloud focus. And the new person who's come in always talks about making a cloud transformation. Yet nearly every time I look at what they actually do, they just migrate everything to the cloud and they haven't actually transformed anything. And so to me, it's like they miss the key advantages of going to the cloud in the first place. I mean, if all you're going to do is pick up all your VMs and sort of rehost them in Azure or AWS, like what exactly did you transform? Apart from the fact that you're now managing hardware basically as infrastructure still in the cloud, as opposed to in some data center that you used to work with.
Yeah, that's a really good point because that is what we really see in a lot of organizations that their migration is like only like let's put things in the cloud. As long as it is in cloud, it's fine. We don't
Mm.
really care have we used the cloud in the right way that we should have used it or not. So it's
More
good.
importantly, though,
Yeah.
I think as well, is they take exactly the same problems they had and migrate them to the cloud. And so it's like, so what exactly did you achieve? And worse, for the users, all the users see is massive disruption, and at best, things still work somewhat like they used to. And so,
Yeah.
what on earth is all that pain that the user's going through for?
So that's a really great point, and a lot of like business owners or someone who is in charge of, let's say, a department or a business should really think about how they do this migration and transformation. What do you think are like areas to look at to make this more successful when we
Well,
are thinking
we
about it?
have, I have sort of 10 areas that I think you could just assess whether your migration is really a transformation or not, right? And look, the first of these is identity. If you haven't sorted out a better identity story than the old domain that you were using on premises, and if all you're really doing is sort of moving that domain controller to the cloud and maybe sort of extending that same domain across into all the VMs, then you haven't done anything, right? If you look at, for most companies today, their primary domain controllers and things, their main domains, these things are the essential thing that everything else ties to. But going forward, I think Azure Active Directory in particular gives you an opportunity to do things very differently than what you had before. It can integrate with the one you've already got on premises, or if you move it up to the cloud. And you can have sort of a hybrid identity story. But importantly, you get to use that same identity in a whole lot of other applications. So going forward, there'll be, say, software as a service application. So your Office 365 identity can be the same one. Power BI, of course, is of interest to both of us. But more than that, so I mean, if you're going to use Zendesk as a help desk, or if you're going to use Dropbox, and so on and so on and so on, whatever these services are that you choose, you don't want to be in a loop where you're having to have separate credentials for every one of those things. I mean, it is not sensible, and you don't need to do that anymore. And a second test is that if I do work for, let's say, superannuation company A, when I do work for them, do they create me an identity as Greg at superannuationcompany.a, or do they just take my SQL Down Under identity and assign me into existing projects and teams and so on? Because the thing is, with Azure AD B2B, business to business, I don't have to get a new identity created inside their organization. They can just assign permissions to my existing identity within my own company. And importantly, if they ever want to, if we had, say, several people from our company working there, they could just turn one setting off and remove every one of us out of their domain, right? It's easy for them to do and clean up later. Whereas when they create these special identities and things, they often get left around for ages, or they don't get cleaned up properly and so on. And finally, Azure AD has B2C, which is the business to consumer, and that allows you to build entire directories of all your clients or customers or members or things like that. And if you still have applications that have tables of users with, usernames and hashed passwords and things like that, you're not doing it right?
Yeah.
I always tell people, every time you find yourself building a security infrastructure or authentication, if you're building that, you need to be sort of hitting yourself in the head and telling yourself not to do it. It's hard. Companies like Microsoft and Google and people get it wrong, and they have an enormous number of people working on it every day of the week. It's incredibly arrogant that a company thinks they can spin up their own authentication system and get it right.
Yeah, correct. That's a really good point. That identity is definitely like the one big area to look at. What are other areas you think important?
Another key one is how the databases are used. So if all you're doing with SQL Server is picking it up and putting it into a VM in the cloud, then again, you're not really getting the great benefit. You're much better off, if you can, to be running with Azure SQL Database instead as a platform service. Because companies, you don't want to be managing the database at that level anymore. You don't want to be doing that. I mean, from a developer or a whatever point of view, all I want is a T-SQL endpoint that I can talk to so I can send commands to it. And all I want to say is how big should the thing be, where should it be, how fast should it be, and so on. And is there a copy held somewhere else? Well, where's that copy? That's entirely different, managing at that level, to managing at the level of how do I construct availability groups and how do I do all the network configuration and configure listeners and all this sort of low-level stuff. You need to free yourself from that, right? So, I mean, it shouldn't matter to you how the replica works. You just want to tick a box and have it work. And importantly, it's more likely to keep working if you do that, because there's a team of really, really good people are going to help make it keep working, right? And they have better processes than you do to keep it running that way. And so that's how you should be thinking about databases, not pick up your existing problems and take them to the cloud. And a good indication is, even if you have to use the managed instance versions of SQL Server, then you're really still not probably making a proper transformation.
Right, and that brings a really good point that like moving towards platform as a service or software as a service will bring a lot of other components as well. Like beside database, we have like other ETL services and things like that to look at. What other areas?
Other ones for me, if you look at how you structure multiple databases, again, there's always a tendency on premises to have, one large database if you have a software as a service application and have all of your tenants inside that. A more cloudy approach would be to have separate databases for each one of them, and or maybe look at elastic pools or things like that. But again, being able to have separate databases for each of your clients is a much better story in terms of security, because so many companies I deal with, if they accidentally exposed one customer's data to someone else, that can be very, very painful, And so in some companies, it's embarrassing. In other companies, it would be terminal for the company to do that. And so you've got to make a decision as to how important that is to you or not, right? And so you can't afford that to happen. But the other thing is, you might want some customers to have systems that run much faster and pay more. And you might have other customers that are just trying things and, slow and cheap is what they want and so on. Pushing them all into the same environment is not actually sensible. And also, it makes it easier to do things like if someone messes up and wants to roll back to yesterday or something, you can just do that for one customer quite easily. And so to me, that's a key thing. Another really obvious one is storage. I can't tell you the number of times I'm in customer sites and they're just endlessly running out of storage, disk space. So many projects are constrained because they run out of space, and so many services fall over because they're just not allocated enough space. And this is because it's being done on wickedly expensive corporate SANs and so on that don't even really perform very well anyway. Where if you look at in the cloud sort of based environments, you get to choose tiers. You can have whatever speed you want, basically. You can have redundancy. You can have soft deletes on certain things, and so to protect you against ransomware and so on. All these sorts of things suddenly become much, much easier to do. And the question is, are you taking advantage of that, right? And so are you using the storage itself as a service rather than just provisioning VMs with attached disks and still managing all the same thing you were before?
Yeah, storage is definitely another important area. And I guess your other important area is like how the transformation and loading process works.
Sure. Again, in the case of SQL Server, that's one dear to my heart. Integration services has always been the tool we've used in the past on premises. Now, you can pick that up and shift that into the cloud. If you look at Azure Data Factory, you can run integration services runtimes inside that. But again, if you're doing that, you're not transforming it, right? If you can, what I prefer to do is build native ADF pipelines, Data Factory pipelines, and use them to replace the integration services code. And certainly if there's anything row by row processing and so on in that integration services code, that's better off done in a database anyway.
Yeah, that's right, because like the new technology needs a new way of doing things, which is definitely much better than the old way of doing things. How the licensing would work in this?
Yeah, licensing, again, I think you need to think about moving across to, again, the preference I have for platform services is they come bundled with the licensing. So the thing is, if I need bigger systems or I need smaller systems or I need to update to the latest things and so on, that's easier to do, in those environments where, again, there's a lot of people who are still caught in the the previous model of every few years, maybe 3 or so years, we buy new licenses. Now, you can pick that same licensing problem up and take it to the cloud with you, but it's not the cleverest thing you're ever going to do. Right? And it's always what happens is then the upgrades get delayed for whatever reason. And sometimes that's the vendor support that doesn't allow you to move. But often it's a capital expenditure thing too. Whereas if you get yourself across to a recurrent expenditure rather than capital expenditure and buying licenses and things, again, you're better off. And just pay for it on demand, at the size that's required for the particular time. Another thing, if I look at just there's a real agility issue in here as well. Like I remember doing work for a software house, and I needed to test some things on availability groups for them. And I remember I wanted to just spin them up in Azure and do the testing, and they wouldn't let me do that. They said they needed to do it with their own servers. Now, it took them 6 weeks to get a quote back for the servers. It took them, once they got the servers, it took them another 4 weeks to get the servers spun up and ready. Then they told me they couldn't install the servers because they couldn't take a power outage in the rack for another couple of weeks, and so on. And somehow this is meant to be better. That's just completely ridiculous. I mean, I could have spun them up in Azure the next day, done the testing, and shut them down again immediately. I mean, so you don't want to own equipment for things like this. It doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah, that's a really great point and great example. What about application in this type of
again, you want to look at changing your applications to something that is stateless, and preferably I like native web applications that run in Azure Web Apps. So the upside of that is that you get to do all of the scaling options and so on. So if you have an application, you can simply set the fact that if it gets busier than 80% for more than a few minutes or something, then spin up another instance of the web app, or another, or two, or whatever, and also have it scale back down again. So you don't need to provision an enormous amount of equipment in case someone comes to use it. If you've structured your apps properly, they can actually spin up and down the amount of resources they're using, and they can respond to extra demand.
Great. And how would the testing work in this, let's say, scenario?
Again, I think people shouldn't be looking at owning their own test equipment so much anymore. If I look at how testing equipment works in most places I go into, particularly software houses, I work in a lot of those as well, there's often a specific set of testing hardware, and there's a big queue of people trying to get tests down through those machines, and it's a significant bottleneck. And then there's got other periods where it's almost not used at all. So you've got this massive equipment that basically isn't used. This is a perfect example of something that you can where you can get a much better outcome by having all of this stuff spun up on demand. And importantly, if I had 12 developers who are looking to do testing, if I have it virtual where we spin up the environments for the testing just to run their tests and then spin them down again, that's way better than having a queue that those people go into. And in the end, the beauty of cloud pricing is that it doesn't matter whether you have 1,000 machines for 3 hours or you have 3 machines for 1,000 hours. It's the same price, right? So the thing is, you can actually end up with it being whether it's cost equivalent anyway.
That's a great example. Thank you. How the project management work in this?
Again, a lot of places I go into at the moment don't have good project management now to start with. And again, there are good tools for that. Azure DevOps has been one that I've been pretty keen on for quite a while. There's a move there to move the repository and a lot of the stuff across to GitHub. I mean, I'm comfy with that as well. But the thing I like with Azure DevOps is it's a complete end-to-end story at the moment. And that fits really, really nicely with the sort of projects that we've been involved with. But again, you want that sort of tooling. You want decent tooling that does your repository work, that does tracking of test cases, that does the equivalent of boards like a Kanban board and so on. You really need something that is a rich environment for that to work.
Correct. And is there anything else you think would be important for this process in addition to all of these
I
things?
think the final thing I'd mention is if you're going to make a move to the cloud and you're going to do things like that, did you actually expand your horizons in any way? I mean, if after you get through the whole effort, you're still back doing exactly what you were in the first place, then what was that all for, right? I mean, there may have been some reliability and potentially cost issues or something like that. But from the user's point of view, can they do things now that they couldn't do before? And so on. And now, have you enabled them to do that, right? So, I mean, a good example I often give is if I went to a superannuation company B.com and you asked them things like, are there any AI or cognitive services things or whatever that you could make use of? They'd tell you no. They can't think of things like that. Yet there's so many instances where you can do these things. And so to give you an example, every one of the superannuation companies, runs call centers. Now, it's so easy now by comparison to take all the calls, transcribe them, start doing sentiment analysis, and a whole lot of analysis on what was being discussed. Now, if you look at a typical call center, the way they work today, most people occasionally people listen to one or two calls out of hundreds or thousands of calls to try and assess if people are doing the right thing. I mean, as an example, in a super company in a call center, you're not allowed to say words like, I recommend you, or, I suggest that you, these are deadly words, right? The beauty now is that we can transcribe every single call, find any instance where somebody said one of these trigger phrases, and then we can grab the words that they said after that, and we can pull all of that back for analysis. Now, that puts the company in a completely different position when somebody starts discussing, are your people suggesting things they shouldn't and so on, right? And so as opposed to I listened to one or two calls, right? That's a completely different story.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's a fantastic list of areas to look at for a business or department to be successful for transforming into the cloud rather than just migrating whatever they have. Thank you for mentioning all of these. Do you have any last points to mention that we haven't covered?
Not particularly, Reza. The only thing is a lot of people, I'm a bit of a technology junkie. I just every day spend some time learning about things that are happening or how I could do things differently and so on. And I think it's a wonderful time to be involved in this sort of industry.
Great, thank you. And how our audience can reach out to you if they have any questions? What is the best way?
Look, easiest, just greg@greglow.com is really easy. Our details, I've got the website at sqldownunder.com, and there's a lot of info about me at greglow.me. But yeah, all good. Or on Twitter or Facebook, and the links are there underneath us. Yeah.
Great. Yep. Thank you. So thank you again for your time, Greg. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We hope this video was helpful for you, this interview. Until next time, goodbye.
See you.